Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Coghlan. Today I'm going to be talking about the carburisation and the oxidation of 9-chrome 1 molybdenum steel when it's exposed to CO2. So the work that I'm going to be talking about was part of my PhD project, and this was at Loughborough University, and it was sponsored by EDF Energy. So today I'm going to give you a bit of a background, then I'm just going to introduce some of the work, then go on to talk about the experimental and some of the results, looking at the carburisation and the oxidation of the 9-chrome steel, and then finish up with a summary and some conclusions. So 9-chrome 1 molybdenum steel contains 9% chromium with 1% molybdenum with some other alloying elements, and it's used within the power industry because it's high creep strength and corrosion resistance. So the relevance of this project is that it is used within the advanced gas cooled reactors by EDF, which are operating in the UK at the moment. So it's used in the AGR plants where it's exposed to high temperatures, high temperature CO2, and under these conditions it's exposed to both oxidation and carburisation. And these carburisation and oxidation change the properties of the steel with exposure time. So the CO2 is able to dissociate the steel within the oxide, so it means that carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, carbon and oxygen can all be present, interacting with the material. So better understanding of this process will allow for better predictions and understanding of the aging that's going on within these plants. So when it's exposed to CO2, it resists the corrosion through the growth of a duplex oxide scale, which consists of the outer grown magnetite from the original interface, an inner porous chromium-rich spinel, and there's also an internal oxidation zone, which is present between the spinel layer growing in ahead of the spinel layer, and it's the chromium-rich spinel layer that's thought to provide the oxidation resistance. So the carburisation of the substrate is taking place simultaneously with the oxidation of the steel, and it can penetrate up to 3 times the thickness of the oxide. And due to the Boudreau reaction, which can be seen there, it means that there's oxygen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and carbon, which are all potentially present. So during the carburisation of the steel, the bulk metal is able to act as a carbon sink, removing this carbon, which leads to the formation of carbides within the material. One of the things which EDF Energy are interested in is the oxidation kinetics. So initially, when exposed, it follows a parabolic oxide growth, but over a period of, and then this stabilizes out. But after a period of time, it may show some rapid mass gain, and this is known as breakaway oxidation, generally associated with the loss of the protective nature of the oxide scale. Thought to be many different reasons, with no one really agreeing on what causes. Some of them range from just geometry effects to carbon saturation within the substrate. So that's one of the key things that was important to try and understand. So I'm going to talk about some of the samples. So the samples which I was looking at were fin samples. So an example there. So the main bulk of the work was focused towards the fin tips because of the geometry, they're more susceptible to breakaway initiation. So I'm just going to show some examples of what we'd class as a pre-breakaway sample or pre-breakaway fin and a breakaway. So this is a considered pre-breakaway sample, but you can see a relatively uniform oxide layer around the whole of the fin. This would be considered breakaway, where the oxide scale is a lot thicker and there's also cracks coming in from the corners. And then a severe breakaway sample here, which would be one which has been continued exposure after breakaway is initiated, and the oxide just rapidly growing, it's kind of peeling away, so you get spillation of material, which obviously don't really want. And a single one of these fin samples may, depending on which fin you're looking at, it might actually show different stages of breakaway oxidation. So the samples that I'm going to be talking about have been exposed to simulated advanced gas cooled reactor conditions inside autoclaves, and the breakaway status of the sample was labelled upon removal from the autoclave. So we range from about 1,500 hours to, I think it's about 15,000 hours, and they've all been exposed at 600 degrees C. So here's just a quick visual comparison of the fins as they increase in exposure time. So now I'm going to just move on and talk about the carburization. So the carbide volume can be measured using ion beam imaging in combination with xenon hexafluoride etchant. So just a quick visual comparison there. So on the left, I think it's about 2,500 hours, and on the right is about 15,000. So you can see that the carbide volume within the substrate, the carbide size, are increasing in size and decreasing in frequency as they effectively coalesce together. But if we take a look at the 15,000 hour sample, have a look, we can see slightly different contrasts within these ion beam images, which suggested that they're increasing with complexity as well towards the later stages of oxidation. So I'm just going to come back to that. But I'm going to come back to that in a minute, sorry. But I've measured the carbide area fraction in a line scan across the fins for a sample which hadn't been described as having suffered breakaway and one which had. And then I plotted that relative to distance across the fin. So the pre-breakaway sample, which had been exposed for 4,500 hours, you can see there's a dip towards the centre of the fin in carbide area fraction, whereas the breakaway sample at 15,000 hours shows very consistent carbide area fraction measurements across, potentially suggesting that the material is saturated with the carbides. And then from those two things, you can see that there's potentially the carbides are increasing in complexity with the exposure time, but you can see clearly that they're increasing in area fraction as well. So we did a bit of thermocalc modelling to have a look at what could potentially be changing with over the time. So we calculated the total phases present within, which predicted to be within the substrate based on increasing carbon concentration of the material, so effectively exposure time. And you can see that as you increase from low carbon to higher carbon concentration, the ferrite within the substrate decreases, whereas the M23C6 carbides and the M7C3 carbides are increasing in volume. So if we have a quick look at the elemental predictions for what these carbides would consist of, for the M23C6, we can see that at the lower carbon concentrations within the substrate, chromium and molybdenum with a small amount of iron are predicted to be present, and at higher carbon concentrations, the ratio between the iron and the chromium is predicted to switch over, so with higher iron and lower chromium, but the molybdenum remains relatively consistent. And if we do the same for the M7C3 carbides, they're not predicted to form until a slightly higher carbon concentration within the substrate, but you have a similar kind of pattern with the chromium. So at higher carbon concentration within the substrate, you have more iron relative to the chromium. But the main difference between the M7C3 elemental compositions and the M23C6 is the molybdenum's predicted to be a lot lower in the M7C3 carbides. So to further characterize these carbides and see what's happening, we prepared some TM lamellar from the middle of a breakaway fin, which had a fin which had suffered breakaway. And this was prepared from near to the oxide substrate interface. So you can see there's quite a few different types of particles which are present in the material, with varying, like for example on the right hand side there's cord particles, there's some particles with chromium rich down the middle, some with molybdenum, some without molybdenum. So we performed selected area diffraction on some of these particles, and we could found that some of the cord ones showing the chromium rich center, and then a slightly more uniform slightly higher ion concentration around was indexed as M23C6, and for some of the particles which showed higher chromium with no very little molybdenum present, it was indexed as M7C3. So it's kind of showing agreement with the thermodynamic predictions which we'd performed. So from the experimental and the thermodynamic modelling I developed kind of like a model of what we thought was happening with the exposure time, so increasing carbon. So initially, during the exposure, you see chromium-rich carbides forming with molybdenum, and these are forming preferentially because of the higher availability of the chromium within the substrate. As the carbon concentration increases, the carbides which are now forming show lower chromium and higher iron concentrations. So some of these might be nucleating off the previous carbide, so that's why you end up with the coring and the chromium-rich centres and the slightly lower chromium outside. But these are also formed not nucleated off a previous carbide, so you just end up with a carbide which is uniform in concentration across. And then as you continue increasing the carbon concentration, you get more of the M7C3 carbides forming within the substrate. So in the same lamellar, actually, we also observed this complex carbide within the breakaway sample, which I considered my favourite carbide. So performed DGS, and you can see that there's like five different areas within the carbide. So one of them on the left shows higher chrome concentration, so the one that's labelled 1, and then 2, 3, and 4 show like a relatively uniform iron and chromium concentration with molybdenum, with 1 not showing any molybdenum concentration. So in combination with what we thought with the elemental predictions, we went and performed selected area diffraction on these separate parts, and we found that the region that was labelled 1 was M7C3, and the other sections were all M23C6, which would have been in agreement with what we'd predicted with the modelling and what we'd seen in the previous characterised carbides. So proposed this based off what we'd seen. So I think that the chromium and molybdenum-rich core was formed first. As the carbon concentration in the substrate increases, the M23C6 regions form, and this is based off showing the more relatively equal chromium, iron and molybdenum concentration. Then finally the M7C3 region was formed later on during it, and this, we're not sure if this might have nucleated and grown, or it might have just like developed and transformed from M23C6 into the M7C3. So yeah, now I'm going to just move on to talk about the oxidation of 9Cr-1Mo molybdenum steel now. So with the continued exposure, the oxide scale continues to grow. So the one on the top there is exposed for about 2,500 hours, and the one on the bottom was 15,000. So increased from about 60 microns thick to about 230 microns thick at the fin tip. So at the interface between the spinel and the substrate, there's an internal oxidation zone that's penetrating into the substrate, and you can see that it's following the chromium-rich oxide within the internal oxidation zone, and it's following along the grain boundaries where you can see the carbides which are present. So it's showing that the oxidation of the steel is taking place through the preferential oxidation of the chromium, which is effectively almost dictated by where the previous carbides are formed, because the majority of them are chromium containing. So then if we take a little step back and have a look at the newly formed spinel layer, we can see that the chromium's begun to disperse a bit more throughout the spinel, whence it's been oxidized. But you can see that there are some of these bright regions which show a similar contrast to the substrate below. So if we take a quick closer look at these, we can see that there's these bright particles within the oxide, within the same region. There's chromium, iron, molybdenum, but there's no oxygen at these particles. So that's suggesting that these are particles which haven't oxidized. So to further look at these, created a TM lamellar of a sample from the spinel oxide, and we found similar particles in these TM lamellas. So if we have a closer look at this, we can see that there is a chromium-rich oxide ring, which is surrounding a iron-rich core, which the iron-rich core hasn't oxidized because there's no oxygen present, and there's molybdenum, which is relatively dispersed throughout this whole area. So formed selected area diffraction to index this, and it was M23C6, so it's showing that the carbides are able to potentially resist oxidation as the oxide front is moving through the material, and remain within the oxide for potentially thousands of hours, because of the, well, we think it's because of the chromium-rich oxide, which have preferentially formed at the oxidation front, and that protects the inner iron-rich carbide region from further oxidation. So just onto some of the summary and conclusion. So the carbides within the substrate have been shown to increase in the volume, size and complexity over the time exposed to carbon dioxide, with both M23C6 and M7C3 being characterized in there. Oxidation of the carbides, majority of the carbides, takes place at the internal oxidation zone with preferential oxidation of chromium. But because we've seen that, you can see the chromium-rich oxides penetrating ahead, and then all of these carbides in the substrate are oxidized at the oxidation front, with some of these remaining in the material, potentially able to resist. Well, we think it's because of the chromium-rich oxide protecting the inner core. We didn't find M7C3 in the substrate, in the oxide, sorry, and we think this is because of the increased chromium concentration of that carbide, and the generally a slightly smaller size, which means that it's oxidizes just oxidizes completely when it's at the oxidation front. So, if anyone's got any questions.
Thanks very much. Okay, so any questions for Lawrence? Maybe I'll kick off with one. The hand-waving explanation for why these things break away is because all the chromium gets mopped up by carburization, so there's not enough to maintain a spinel layer. I mean, is that just hand-waving rubbish, or actually is there any truth in that?
I think there are a lot of different ones, and I think personally that there's several triggers that can lead to it. I think that's one of them. But some of the other ones, which, say, for example, with carbon saturation, that's similarly linked to the chromium being used up because it's all tied up in carbides. Some of the other theories for why it breaks away are because it's effectively a carbide wall forms at the surface by the oxide, so no further carbon is able to, the material is no longer able to act as the carbon sink, and that triggers breakaway. But and then there's also geometry as well, especially with the fin samples. As the oxide continues to grow, you've got it growing around the fin, so that's what leads to cracks. But yeah, there's a lot of discussions at EDF about what is breakaway as well to start with, so that's one of them.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions from anybody else? Fabio, thank you. Someone at the back, I think.
Hi, Lawrence. Thanks for the presentation. Quick one. Have you looked at the thermodynamic stability and oxidation of the carbides, in the sense that the carbides are expected perhaps to decompose and then to release the carbon and the chromium, when then the chromium is subsequently oxidized? So have you looked into the thermodynamic stability and oxidation?
Only with what I've kind of seen. I haven't really looked into it specifically, but I think you do see evidence in some of the breakaway samples of how, with the carbides, once they've been oxidized within the oxide, you can clearly see where they were before, but I haven't looked into it specifically.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, was there a question at the back? Question at the back? No. I have another question actually. Was it iron moly core? Is that linked to metallic? Some kind of spinel phase, or is it a carburized sample? What is that?
What,
core?
the one at the end?
The M23C6
yeah.
and C.
So I think.
What do they grow around?
I think that was a prior M23C6 carbide, which when it was when the oxidation front reached it within the substrate, the chromium effectively diffused outwards to oxidize preferentially to the iron, forming the chromium-rich oxide, which is just effectively, I think it's effectively just the chromium-rich spinel layer, which is what gives the 9-chrome steel its oxidation resistance to start with, but just more concentrated in that area.